Hi everybody, and welcome to the RCSI University of Medicine and Health Sciences. Tonight we're going to be looking at emerging safely from the pandemic, and we'll be using the 6 pillars of lifestyle medicine to look at how we can maximize our health and improve our well-being during this transition phase. This is part of the RCSI's MyHealth series of lectures, and the idea is to empower you to improve your own health and to maximize your own well-being. You're very welcome to the RCSI University of Medicine and Health Sciences. I'm delighted to be joined by my colleagues from the RCSI, Dr. Annie Curtis, who's a senior lecturer in the RCSI School of Pharmacy and Biomolecular Sciences, and a researcher specializing in the area of the body clock and our immune systems. Dr. Helen French is a chartered physiotherapist and senior lecturer at the RCSI School of Physiotherapy, and Helen specializes in exercise for the health of our musculoskeletal system, our muscles and our bones. And Dr. Trudy Meehan, who is a senior clinical psychologist specializing in child and adolescent mental health, and a lecturer at the RCSI Centre for Positive Psychology and Health. Welcome to the RCSI MyHealth series. So we're going to use the pillars of lifestyle medicine to look at where we are now and how we maximize our health during the pandemic. And tonight we're going to be looking at physical activity and exercise. We're going to be looking at positive relationships, and we're also going to be looking at our body clocks and how sleep works and its role in our health. So to begin, can I turn to Helen? And Helen, can you say why is it that physical activity is so important?
Yeah, thanks, Kieran. I guess before the COVID pandemic, we had another pandemic, and that was of physical inactivity, where people weren't undertaking enough physical activity. And it's well established now in the research that being physically active confers a lot of benefits. For example, it reduces the risk of heart disease, risk of stroke, risk of type 2 diabetes. It can reduce the risk of certain cancers like breast cancer, colon cancer. It helps our mental health, so can reduce the risk of depression. It helps our brain health, so our ability to multitask, our memory, our learning. It helps our musculoskeletal health, as you mentioned, that's my particular area. And what we mean by that is our bones, our joints, our muscles and our tendons. And that's particularly useful or important when, for example, as a growing child. So as children are growing to adulthood, they need that time to grow and develop, and exercise and physical activity plays a really important role. And likewise, as we get older, we start to lose muscle mass and we start to lose our bone density, and that is also a critical period for our musculoskeletal health. And of course, now in the last 18 months, we've all become so much more aware of our immune system and how important that is in this pandemic, that actually physical activity can boost our immune system as well. And they are just some of the many, many benefits. And the way I think of physical activity is, if it was a drug, we would all take it without question.
We certainly would, and it's extraordinary when we look at the research, the range of impacts it has. And then Helen, when we think about physical activity and we think about exercise, is there a distinction to be made there by people like yourself who do research in this area?
Yeah, definitely. And even for the people listening in today, there is a distinction, because physical activity refers to any bodily movement where we are expending energy. So that could be activity during our leisure time, our work time, our activities around the house. And that is often the incidental activity that many people don't think of as, you're walking around the shops, you're doing the housework, you're doing the gardening. Whereas exercise is a subcategory of physical activity. So exercise is usually planned, it's purposeful, it's repetitive, it's structured. And people, plan that exercise, and sometimes physical activity isn't planned. And exercise really is mainly undertaken to improve or maintain physical fitness.
That's really interesting distinction. So intention is very important there in terms of the difference between the two. That's really great. We'll come back around then to talk later about what we can do to improve our activity. So that's one of the pillars. Trudy, if I can turn to you, another one of the pillars then is how we cultivate and maintain relationships. And that seems to be, the evidence is that's very, very important. So why are relationships so important for our health and well-being?
It's a great question because it doesn't seem obvious that they would be, but one of the things that's really interesting is that we're actually wired for connection. And that basically means that our biological systems require and respond really well to moments of human connection. And a lot of people are familiar with the autonomic nervous system in terms of the fight-flight response. So our response to stress and threat and that activation that takes place. But the other side of that system is the rest and relax, where we calm down. And that's been renamed by researchers in polyvagal theory who have called it the calm and connect response. And what we know is that in order to calm, we need connection. And that we calm and soothe ourselves better when we co-regulate. So we experience emotions across bodies, not just in one body, which is fascinating and really important for us to understand. So what we've learned is that we can reduce the impact of stress by having moments of connection with other people. And when we reduce stress, that's really good for our physical health and of course our emotional and mental health as well. And the research on this is really interesting. They've tracked, there's a lovely study from Harvard where they tracked these men throughout their whole lives, and they found that it wasn't their cholesterol levels at 50 that predicted how well they would age. It was how happy they were with their relationships, predicted their health and their disease-free years at age 80. And we know outside of that study, because that study was limited, it looked at men, but people who've looked at the blue zones, some of the longest living people in the world in places like Sardinia in Italy or Okinawa in Japan, and the people who have maintained relationships with friends, families and in their local community, they're some of the longest living people and some of the most, they're living with disease for years, which is really important, not just longevity.
That's really interesting. And it makes a lot of sense because we have evolved as a species for connection. So it makes sense we have a biology that's built around connection. If I can follow up then, Trudy, and ask you, this has been a very tough time, this pandemic, in terms of connection, that a lot of people have lost connection. And it's also sadly been a dreadful time for some families where they have unfortunately lost members of their families. People have died, and it's been hidden away. How important has that been, do you think, in terms of the impact of the pandemic on our general health and our psychological health in particular?
Yeah. It's been hugely impactful because we're losing that connection in terms of our daily interactions. And we know from the work of Barbara Fredrickson that something as simple as eye contact in real life is really important for us in terms of developing that connection and having that brain and body synchronization that's health giving. But it's also, we need to acknowledge the losses that people have had. And one of the things we know about loss and when people pass away is that we're not just losing the person, we're also losing our relationship with that person and the identity we had in that relationship. So for example, if somebody was to lose their mother, they lose the position and the opportunity to perform that identity as daughter or son. So there's a double mourning and a double loss. You lose the person and you lose that part of yourself. So and that connection is gone. And one of the things we know that's helpful from narrative therapy talks about remembering the person who has passed and having remembering conversations. And it's a very simple thing, but sometimes people feel like they need to move on and they can be embarrassed to remember and bring people who have passed back into their daily conversations. So it's as simple as something like, oh, if my mother was here, she would really love this dinner, or she would laugh at how I burned the dinner. And it's okay, and it's actually really important to have those moments of remembering. And there's a hyphen in there because you're bringing members of your club of life back into your daily life by remembering them. So you're pulling them back in intentionally. And that's actually really important.
That's really interesting. And in Ireland, of course, we're very good at, we have a long tradition of managing death and dying in particular, but that's all been prevented for many people during the pandemic. We'll come back around to how we might improve or maintain our relationships in a moment. Annie, your research interest is in areas primarily to do with the body clock and our immune system. So for those of us who don't know anything about the body clock, what is it?
Okay, so Kieran, the body clock really is the ability of our bodies to tell time. We're essentially a walking clock. Like I talk to my daughters about, we're like Cogsworth from Beauty and the Beast, and the analogy is good because we've a face and we've a hands. Every single cell in our body actually has the ability to tell the time of day. And that's really important because what the body clock does is, like Trudy talked about synchronizing, what the body clock does is it synchronizes all our bodily functions to the right time of day. So the way I try to remember it is our body clock, which is, it's almost like the conductor of an orchestra. And all our bodily functions are all the different instruments in front of the conductor. And what the body clock does is ensures that all of those bodily functions are timed in the correct way. If you might ask, well, how does our bodies even know what time of day it is? And that's, I think, what's really important for this discussion. The main way that our body senses time of day is through external light. So we often think about, you know, our eyes performing the visual function, taking in all that information for visual capacity. But our eyes are actually taking in a lot of information about the intensity of light that's in our surrounding area. We're really connected to our external environment. And I think in modern society, we've sort of forgotten that connection that's there. So that's what our body clock does. One of the main things that our body clock does, which pertains to this conversation, is it really controls timing of sleep, when we sleep. And it really wants us to sleep at a certain time of day.
And the evidence then, that's really interesting. The evidence then is that sleep is particularly important for our health. I think we've, in the last 20 years, we're just becoming more and more aware of quite how important sleep is.
Yeah, I think sleep has really gotten a renaissance, I suppose, in the last 20 years, just because the research has really allowed us to pick apart what sleep is doing. Mm-hmm. So, you know, if we think about like, well, what is sleep? Okay, well, it's nearly easier to describe what it's not. It's not wakefulness. We're in a very altered state of consciousness. Our ability to sense things and to move is very much diminished. People have this bit of a misconception that sleep is a very sort of passive activity. You know, it's like turning off your computer, putting it to sleep, you know, nothing is happening. But actually that's not what's happening. Sleep is a highly active, highly regulated process. There's 4 stages of sleep. People will be familiar with non-REM sleep versus REM. Non-REM is the deep wave sleep, and REM is the dream sleep. Yeah. But there's 4 stages in sleep, which takes about 90 to 120 minutes to get through. And in order for us to have a full night's sleep, we need to go through that cycle about 5 to 6 times.
And that's different than at different stages of our lives. So babies spend a huge amount of time in that kind of our REM sleep, that dreaming sleep. Yeah,
so I think if you ask any parents of newborn babies, they wonder when they sleep. But actually, babies do sleep about 16 to 18 hours a day. Yeah. When you get a little bit older, when you've children who are going to school, they need about 9 to 11 hours of sleep. Teenagers, and people do forget this because I think teenagers are probably the most sleep deprived in our society. Teenagers need 8 to 10 hours, and then the rest of us, Kieran, need about 7 to 9 hours of sleep. As we get a little bit older, that diminishes a little bit. It's probably between the 7 to 8 hours of sleep.
Okay, that's right. I find for me it's going the opposite direction. As I get older, I seem to need more. So we'll come back in a moment to look at how we could improve our sleep. So we're looking at this amazing system that we have, which is very subtle, very sophisticated, our physical systems, our mental systems, and how these interact with each other. It's awe-inspiring really when you get into the science of it. If we start to think about how we improve matters for ourselves then coming out of this, hopefully coming out of this pandemic, Helen, can I come back to you on that? So you're saying there's been a pandemic of lack of activity. What's your advice to people watching about how we can improve then the amount of exercise, the amount of physical activity, I presume, that we're taking.
Yeah, and I think it might be worth just reminding everybody what the guidelines say about how much physical activity is required, because there are guidelines, really clear guidelines for adults and for children. And so for adults, 150 minutes per week of moderate intensity physical activity. So of course people will say, well, what do we mean by moderate intensity? So that's where your heart rate's a little bit faster, you're breathing a little bit faster, and you feel a little bit warmer. And people can gauge that themselves. Or people can do less time but more vigorous. So 75 minutes of vigorous level activity is comparable to the 150 minutes. And that was previously described as 30 minutes 5 days a week. And that doesn't sound like much, but yet approximately a third of our population, of our adult population, do reach that level, which means 2/3 don't. So that's a really high proportion that aren't even reaching those minimal guidelines. And then for children should be physically active every day for at least 60 minutes. And of course, the other emerging area really is that we're now becoming more sedentary, and that's again our lifestyle is kind of enforcing all these sedentary type of behaviours. And as well as moving more, we also should be sitting less. And we should be breaking up our sitting time. So, you've mentioned the pandemic there. We've had a lot of people, in confined to their home for long periods of time. They were more sedentary. Research has shown that, suppose kind of across the population, physical activity did reduce. And now people have to try and get back into a routine of first of all, increasing the physical activity that they were at beforehand, but for some people they weren't even at that level of physical activity. So I think of physical activity, and well, it's not just me, it's the research shows this, but it is a behaviour. Physical activity is something that we should just kind of do automatically. We shouldn't think about it. So for example, the person sitting at their desk at work should be in a routine of getting up every 30 minutes and just doing a quick move around, a quick stretch, just getting themselves out of that position. Lots of research have looked at what are the barriers to physical activity. And there are lots, but I guess you could bring it down to two kind of common ones, which are time and motivation. And so time is a problem. Everybody has busy lives. So we have to make physical activity become part of our lives. So there are lots of little examples of how you could do that. So for example, if you are commuting to work on public transport, you could get off the bus one stop earlier and walk the rest of the way. If you have a stairs and an escalator in front of you, take the stairs. That's kind of a no-brainer. Even when you're doing your housework, you could be a little bit more vigorous about it, or your DIY or your gardening, and just get that heart rate up a little bit. Push the lawnmower a little bit faster. So there are lots of simple examples of doing that, but it does require a little bit of thought and a bit of planning, and it has to become routine. And so the motivation is the second barrier for a lot of people. And sometimes it is just trying to get going. And, Trudy has mentioned there the importance of relationships. So having some peer support, I think, would be really helpful. So, a family member, a friend, all you need is one other person to say, we're going to go out for a walk, 10 minutes around the block, just to kind of stretch our legs and get moving. And, for some people who are doing minimal levels of activity, start with something small. It doesn't have to be 30 minutes 5 days a week. Start with 5 minutes 3 days a week. Start with something rather than nothing. So there are lots of other ways of trying to increase your physical activity. I think it has to be picking something you enjoy doing. So if people do want to take up a new activity, I think there's plenty of choice out there, but you have to want to do it. So there are just some of the examples.
That's so interesting. And I think the really interesting thing, I think the research shows, if I'm right, and that any activity is better than none. So people don't feel they have to kind of run a marathon. You can start easy and as you say, carry on then. Yeah.
Exactly. And I think a really important part of that is to set goals. So when we try to change behaviours, one of the common principles of changing behaviour is that we need a target, we need a goal, but it also needs to be a realistic goal. So for example, there is no point in saying, I'm going to try and run a marathon, when you don't even run, 2 kilometres. So people do have to be realistic about setting goals, but there are plenty of opportunities out there, and I'll kind of give some guidance about even good websites to look at. But for example, reward yourself. So if you do set a goal and you get to that goal, which is an achievable goal, set yourself some reward system. And the resources that I'm really referring to are Healthy Ireland. They are just fantastic resources. And at the moment now, they have an initiative called Let's Get Back. And that is really exactly what we're talking about tonight. Let's get people back to the physical activity, to the exercise that they were doing before this pandemic.
That's really, really helpful. And that just to link that to what Trudy has been saying then about relationships, you talk about, you know, running together or walking together. A lot of people have done that. What about if we take that relationships? We know relationships are very important for our health. How do people develop positive relationships and maintain them in as much as we possibly can?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it changes across the age groups. But one of the things we know that's really important for developing healthy relationships is our ability to play. So developmentally, we have to play. Play has a huge role in making us good at being social. So especially for young people, they need time to play, and that's free, unstructured play, where they decide the activity and the next step. They have to negotiate roles and boundaries together without adult intervention. And that's a really important thing for young people. Then for the rest of us as adults, the good news is that you don't have to be in a long-term romantic relationship. That's not the only way to have healthy and positive interactions in terms of relationships. And Barbara Fredrickson's work is really important on this. And what she tells us is that we can have micro moments of positivity resonance, positive connection among people that we meet for small moments and even among strangers. And that happens when we make connection through eye contact, smiling, and positive regard that you share in this moment. And her research is really interesting because positive emotions, such as connection, are quite small in terms of their impact, and she's found ways to measure those impacts biologically. So she's shown the impact on our systems and how when we smile at each other and when we make eye contact, how there's an increase in oxytocin, and that feels good, it's very calming, it helps us feel more connected. And the thing is, these things happen together. When we feel connected, we feel more positive. When we feel more positive, we're more likely to connect. So it's a cycle. So sometimes, especially if after being in isolation, and a lot of people talk about this, I'm feeling in a funk, I haven't been connecting with people, how do I get out of it? And in a way they're answering their own question, you haven't been connecting with people. That might be the first thing to do. And that's often just getting out and about, nodding, waving to a neighbour, smiling at the person in the shop that you're having an interaction with, making eye contact in the retail setting, and starting with small steps to reconnect with people. It's not about having 20 friends and joining clubs and having this huge circle around you. It's in the small interactions in our community and in our daily lives.
That's very interesting. It does make you wonder a bit, Trudy, about kids, you know, who are connected on their phones all the time, but not connecting directly with each other, you know, in the real world, so to speak.
It's really important to address this and start to look at it. Technology is great in that it opens up a whole world for us, but it does impact in that it reduces our opportunity for real life interaction. And we know, especially for young people, real life interaction is essential for their development. Yeah. The British Psychological Society at the moment have a campaign running called Time to Play, where they're advocating for 10 minutes extra in the school day of playtime. And they have a huge position paper on the benefits of this for young people's emotional and psychological development. It's a tiny thing, but we really need to look at it.
Yeah. So, Helen, for many people watching, you know, be interested in encouraging children to increase their physical activity. Now, what would your advice be in relation to that?
Yeah, well, we can certainly apply a lot of the principles for adults to children, but there may be some differences. So first of all, you know, the parent being a role model is really important. So if you're physically active and your child see you enjoying that, they are more likely to do that. Also, children like play. Again, Trudy has mentioned really nicely about the importance of play, and play could be active play. So again, you know, games that will encourage physical activity. Even if we look at simple ball games, you know, within those ball games, particularly for younger children, we have the development of fundamental movement skills, kicking, throwing, catching. And, you know, organised sport is an option, and it's not for everybody. Not every child wants to take part in sport, but we have some really inclusive organisations in Ireland, and the GAA, I think, is just a perfect example of that. If you go out on a Saturday or Sunday morning to any GAA pitch, you will see like hundreds of kids just playing with each other. Again, it's fostering those relationships, the socialisation, and it's not serious, it's just getting them moving, getting them having a bit of fun. So, you know, they are some of, I think, my kind of key principles for children. Again, there are lots of resources online to help parents in terms of navigating this massive area. But I think most important, children have to enjoy what they're doing, and then they're more likely to continue to do it.
And what you're both saying there really, in terms of both physical activity and social relationships, we've got to work on it a bit. I mean, we've got to be a little bit proactive. Now, Annie, the same thing, if I could turn to you, if we can start to look at what's stopping us getting enough sleep, and then what do we do about it? How do we increase the amount of sleep we get? And I presume the quality of sleep is the important thing.
Yeah, so it kind of feeds into what both Helen and Trudy said. So probably in today's society, what's really stopping us getting enough sleep is this 24/7 society that we live in, this constant go, and also our relationship with light. And I know I spoke about this because light impacts our body clock. If you impact your body clock, you impact your ability to get sleep. And one simple tip that I would give is to really try to live bright days and dark nights. But in modern society, with technology, that's really been turned on its head. If we think about, like, we've only been living with electricity for the last 100 years, and that's like a drop in the ocean in comparison to how long we've been on this earth. But even when electricity came, you know, the electric lights were above us, were on walls. Then even with the age of television, the television was maybe 7 or 8 feet away from us, that light source. But now where is our light source? It's in our hand. It's the smartphones that are in our hands, and they're emitting a lot of very detrimental blue light, because it's detrimental to our sleep, at the absolute wrong time, because we're looking at our smartphones right before we go to bed. So this light source has come into our hands, and it's now actually gone into our bedrooms as well. So that's one real big issue about what's preventing us from getting sleep. There's also a real commercial drive for us not to sleep. So if we think about Netflix, so the CEO of Netflix said that its biggest competitor was sleep, and that they were winning. They don't want you asleep, they want you awake. So there's a real commercial drive. And then as well as that, the final thing is, as we age, our ability to stay asleep changes as well. So they're the real factors that are impacting us in getting the full night's sleep that we need.
That's very interesting. And you don't think about that, the role of commercial systems. Because of course you can't be buying things online if you're asleep.
You can't be buying things, you can't be clicking on ads, you can't be doing, you know, any of those things. So in a way, you know, the smartphones, it's a double whammy. They're emitting the light, but they're also like really, their drive is to keep you awake and active.
Yeah. That's very interesting. What do you think the impact of the pandemic then has been on our sleep? It's been quite variable. The pandemic has been, there's been good aspects to the pandemic and bad aspects. And really to pick up on what Trudy said, one of the negative aspects of the pandemic has been an increase in anxiety. And it's probably, as Trudy said, it's lack of connection, lack of that soothing effect on our systems. And certainly we can see from the research that with the pandemic, anxiety levels, especially more so in females than in males, really went up. Mm-hmm. That didn't necessarily impact so much on how long we slept, but it really did impact on the quality, you know, the quality sleep and the consolation of the sleep that we had. Now, there's other data that would show that, well, with the pandemic, we've not much more flexible schedules, and that's a really good thing for our body clock and our sleep. The fact that we're not, you know, socially driven to be at a place at a certain time, that really helps people who are larks versus owls. So that can maybe align us more closely with our natural circadian rhythms, our body clock rhythms, and that can be a good thing. But the only thing that we have to remember is there's a bit of inequity with that as well, because people who work shift work, they don't have the luxury of, you know, changing their schedules. So 20% of the population work shift work. It's very detrimental to their sleep, it's very detrimental to their health. And actually more individuals who are in lower socioeconomic status, they're more likely to work shift work as well. So they may not benefit from the blended working and more flexible schedules that we're talking about all the time. It's really interesting. I think all three of you are saying, you know, we've been through a tough time with the pandemic, but there is a sense we're coming out of this, and there's a sense that we do need to take, you know, control, if we like, over our physical activity, over our sleep, and by doing so, that helps us to actually make this transition back into a normal or as normal a life as possible. Would that be a fair comment?
Yeah, definitely. I think that's the thing, we need to take responsibility. Yeah. And it can be scary. And I know a lot of people have questions around how to overcome that anxiety, but we know from psychology there's a treatment for OCD that's called exposure and response prevention. So you need to expose yourself to the anxiety creating situation and prevent your anxious response. So you stop yourself from doing the thing that you would normally do when you're anxious. And in a way, we need to start doing that now, going back out into the world. We need to tolerate the feeling of anxiety, not turn back into the house.
Yes, yeah. So I'm anxious, but I'm able to manage it. And I presume help children then to tolerate that as well.
It's really important. We have to, as adults, as parents and caregivers, be able to tolerate our own anxiety around this so that we can support children and help them co-regulate their anxiety and soothe them. But we can't soothe them unless we can soothe ourselves.
Yeah, there's a kind of hidden cost to this for kids who've been told you can't interact with other children, you got to be, and now all of a sudden we're back trying to get. Good, okay. So as we're coming to the end then, what I'd like to do is get the kind of the key take-home messages that we can go with. If we're going to take something for ourselves on our own health from today's session. Helen, could I start with you? What would your key take-home messages be for people watching this MyHealth episode?
Well, hopefully I've sold the benefits of physical activity for starters, and if you're somebody who really isn't in a routine of doing that, first of all, start somewhere. Start, you know, with small amounts. Small amounts is better than no amounts. And, you know, if you have children who also have lost their physical activity levels or reduced their physical activity levels because of all of the things that have happened in the last 18 months, you know, you being a role model for that child will also help their physical activity. So that would be my first point. And then really it's about set a realistic goal. You know, start small, set something that's achievable, and then, as I said there, reward yourself for that. I think we have to, you know, use, in coming back to Annie's point, I think we have, you know, the outdoors is going to kind of hit both elements of sleep and body clocks and also physical activity. And, you know, people will often say, oh, well, the weather is not, it's terrible in Ireland. And I think you really have to overcome that barrier if you're going to live in Ireland and try to keep physically active, you know. So buy a good rain jacket and a warm coat in the winter and a warm hat and get out and enjoy the outdoors. And the one thing that really struck me in the pandemic, particularly when we were in our 5K restrictions, was seeing families, entire families out. And I was seeing the kids on their scooters and their bikes, and I was seeing the parents walking beside them, and I was seeing teenage kids walking with their parents, and I actually thought that was fantastic. So here we were seeing now, it's coming back to Trudy's point about relationships, we were seeing the family unit now you know, doing physical activity together. So, you know, I think that's another really good way of trying to increase physical activity, have that peer support, your family and your friends. And I suppose my final tip is there are so many resources out there, and you want to go to trusted resources and trusted information. So the World Health Organization has lots of fact sheets about physical activity. Healthy Ireland is a fantastic resource which is very Ireland specific and can link you to loads of sports partnerships and loads of resources that are available in Ireland. So really it's just about, you know, making that first step.
That's and we can put those sites up on our on our own website for people who want to follow through. Thanks very much for that. Trudy, same question to you. You know, for people watching us thinking about this and maybe saying I might want to do something, you know, out of this to improve my relationships, maintain relationships. What would your takeaway advice be for people?
Yeah, it's incredibly basic in a way that good relationships start with eye contact. And many of us, we find ourselves at home, our partner or our children are talking and we're stuck into the screen and we're nodding or answering. Put down the screen, make eye contact, smile, respond to the people who are around you. Get out of the house, find people to make eye contact with outside. Be adventurous, take those steps and start with that. I think that's really important. For young people then, I think it's important for parents and caregivers. We know that other young people are important, but adults are important as well. And as teenagers turn away from their parents and caregivers, they need other adults that they can turn to. And we lost that opportunity to connect with extended family, neighbours, other adults in the community. So make time for young people to reconnect with the adults in their lives, as well as time for them to play with their peers. That would be my suggestion.
And Trudy, what about for people who have experienced loneliness and are on their own now? How do they start to, is there anything they can do to help move out from that?
Yeah, I think there's two things. The first one is obviously to move out from that, but that starts with maybe just an acknowledgement of the realistic pain that is caused by loneliness. It's very detrimental and it's very painful. And it's a stress response. When we're lonely, we feel stressed and we feel under threat. So I think to acknowledge that is a big part of that, because we can't move out of that stress state until we realise we're stressed. Yes. So to acknowledge it, to have some self-compassion, and to look at some self-compassion techniques to soothe our bodies. Yes. Because it's quite a brave step to get out there, and it can be really scary. So before we leave and before we break our isolation, we have to soothe ourselves a little bit. So looking at maybe a loving kindness meditation, where research shows the benefit of that, yes. Forgiving ourselves, some self-love and self-compassion can be a very basic first step.
That's very interesting. Thank you very much for that, Trudy. And Annie, same question for you. When people are thinking about this in terms of the body clock and sleep, what's your take-home advice for people?
Yeah, so I love, sort of to echo what both Helen and Trudy said, I love this idea of just the middle way. It's very much small steps. So if we think about sleep, we haven't spoken about this here, but too much sleep is actually as bad as too little sleep. Right. So in a way, we want to try to move into the middle and move into that, that sweet spot of sleep, good quality, 7 to 9 hours of sleep. And it really is the small things, like our relationship with light. You really have to look at your relationship with light. Are you getting out more during the day? And I would say as well to what Helen said, there's no excuse in Ireland. Even though we don't have big, bright, sunny days, it's a lot brighter outside than it is inside. It's much better for us to be outside during the day and then inside in lower light during the evening time and when we're about to go to sleep. I would also say schedule is critical. So, Trudy mentioned we're wired for connection, we're wired for routine. Our body clocks love routine. So that is waking up and going to bed at the same time, pretty much the same time, as boring as it sounds, during the weekdays and during the weekends. Because what's happening now is we're actually giving ourselves a thing called social jet lag, that we have one schedule during the week, we have a very separate schedule during the weekend, and then we have to bring ourselves back onto that new schedule, that work schedule again. And that's causing a lot of issues in terms of our body clock and our sleep. I'd also say, instead of saying, I'm never going to drink coffee again, I would say just, again, the middle way. Can you drink maybe less coffee? Or can you, maybe your last cup of coffee, have that earlier in the day? Caffeine has a half-life of 5 hours. It takes a long time for us to metabolize caffeine. So even though you might be having a cup of coffee at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, you think that's not affecting your sleep, it can actually affect your sleep. And then the last thing I would say is, really make sleep a priority. Really actually start tracking the hours of sleep that you're having. Get a sleep diary. I would even say set an alarm clock for when you go to bed, not for when you get up, so that you have that consistent time of when you go to bed. You're going to wake up naturally when you've had enough sleep. And even by tracking the amount of sleep and even journaling, seeing how you're feeling the next day, making a note of that is real positive reinforcement that you're really seeing the benefits of good quality sleep and how that's impacting on your life. Like, I think all of these things that we're saying are common sense, but they're not necessarily all common practice. And that's what we have to try to do. We have to practice these things in our lives.
So Annie, you mentioned the effects of caffeine on our sleep. A lot of people will be asking themselves, what's the effect of alcohol on our sleep? What's your advice in relation to alcohol and sleep?
Yeah, so there's a bit of a misconception out there as well that alcohol promotes sleep. We hear about the nightcap and all of that. And in reality, actually, alcohol inhibits sleep. It doesn't allow us to go into the regular sleep. It's more of a sedative type of state that we're in under alcohol. And as well as that, one thing about alcohol is it really kills our REM sleep. So I think people may have experienced, especially as you get to middle age and older, that if you've had a couple of drinks, you actually wake up at about 4 a.m. in the morning, bright as a button. Well, not bright, but just can't get back to sleep. And that's because that's when we consume most of our REM sleep, and that's really impacted by alcohol.
That's very, and REM sleep is particularly important for our health. Yeah.
Well, REM sleep is really the creative part of our health, or of the sleep. You know, it really gives us, you know, inspiration, creativity, even sort of the courage to go out and make connections. That's all impacted then by our REM sleep.
That's fantastic. Thanks very much for that, Annie. So that concludes our discussion of the first three pillars of lifestyle medicine in relation to this transition phase from the pandemic. My sincere thanks to our guest experts, Dr. Annie Curtis, Dr. Trudy Meehan and Dr. Helen French. So in part two of this discussion on lifestyle factors and health and well-being, we're going to focus on the other three pillars of lifestyle medicine, diet and nutrition, stress reduction and harmful substance use. Further details of the upcoming MyHealth lectures can be found on the RCSI website. From all of us here at the RCSI University of Medicine and Health Sciences, thank you for watching and stay safe.